Steven Tyler, the ferocious soul of Aerosmith, the eternal screaming demon and the thunderous voice behind the hit song Dream On, is more than just a rock star. He is a living volcano, a hurricane of fire and rage, a man who etched his name into the very fabric of rock and roll, and he is thunder made flesh. He changed the definition of what it means to perform live. With each scream, he defied gravity for over 50 years, transforming chaos into glory and suffering into poetry. A living monument who dedicated his entire being to the art form. He overcame the most terrible abysses, the grip of addiction, the violent collisions that broke his body, the burden of disease, and the betrayals of love that left scars that would never go away. But each time he got back up and screamed louder than the storm. Anyone else might have been crushed by these storms, but he stood tall, his voice more powerful than the agony. And now at 77, fate is cruel again. A final storm rises silently, revealing a wound never before seen as darkness engulfs the brilliant light of his glory. The world is left wondering what kind of torment is more cruel than anything Steven Tyler has ever experienced as a result of this silent agony. It is extremely painful, almost cruel, to realize that the roar that would one day define generations was not born from glory but rather from silence, sorrow, and invisible scars. If his voice has ever touched your life, strike like a sign of respect for the man who transformed suffering into an enduring legacy. Steven Victor Tallarico was born on March 26, 1948 in Yonkers, New York, into a family that appeared stable on the outside, but carried a burden he would never be able to explain. His mother, Susan Ray, was the quiet, devoted secretary who kept the family together, while his father, Victor A. Tallarico, was a strict and accomplished classical pianist who filled their modest middle-class home with the notes of Chopin, Bach, and Beethoven. Despite being surrounded by family and music, Steven frequently felt like a restless soul navigating a world that did not comprehend him. Despite having one older sister, Linda, his body wouldn't stay still in class. His thoughts were dispersed like uncontrollable sparks. His teachers referred to him as unruly. His classmates thought he was unique, and every reprimand had a deeper impact than words could convey. Doctors would refer to it as ADHD years later. However, he was merely called troubled, broken, and hopeless in the 1950s. He would remember with bitter candor, "School never made sense to me." He hid beneath the piano and pressed his ear against the wood while his father's fingers danced above, taking in every vibration as if it were a secret that only he knew. Music was the only language I understood, Steven recalled. I grew up under the piano listening and living in between the notes of Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, words that reverberate like a wounded child seeking solace. While he felt a strong desire to escape, scream, and unleash chaos where only order was permitted, the piano became both his haven and his prison, requiring perfection and discipline. By the time he was in his early teens in the late 1950s, salvation had arrived like lightning. Steven learned about rock and roll's wild defiance, the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds. It wasn't courteous. It wasn't flawless. It was rebellion, sweat, and unadulterated fire. And for the first time, he recognized himself in that rawness. Once written off as hopeless, the boy now saw another destiny looming, one that was forged in defiance, noise, and passion, rather than being bound to silence. Every injury, rejection, and scar served as fuel for an impending storm. The world would soon hear a scream so strong it would never be forgotten. Steven Tyler's first real spark emerged from the silence and scars of his early years, not with fame, but in a smoky New Hampshire pub where Joe Perry's raw guitar ripped through the atmosphere. And destiny roared in that moment. In 1970, Steven saw a reflection of his own wild spirit in Perry's wild playing. They exchanged words, shared laughter, and forged a bond that would eventually give birth to Aerosmith in the electricity of that night. They started out as hungry dreamers, clutching used instruments and pursuing a sound that seemed bigger than life, alongside Tom Hamilton, Joey Kramer, and eventually Brad Whitford. Instead of a mansion, their first residence as a band was a small flat at 1325 Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. It was so confining that it felt more like a prison of dreams than a place to call home. 5 young men survived on stale bread and cheap noodles. The air was heavy with sweat and smoke, the walls were cracked, and the floors were sticky from beer spills. They practiced night after night until their bodies failed them, fingers raw, throats hoarse, falling to the ground and then getting back up to play the same riff 100 times until it felt like salvation. Steven would later remember, We were starving, broke, and exhausted, but the music kept us alive. The walls were being battered by the neighbors, but something timeless was developing within them. As restless as ever, Stephen wrapped a scarf around his microphone stand to prevent it from slipping during the performance. Their first official performance took place on November 6, 1970, at Nipmuc Regional High School in Massachusetts. What started out as a last-ditch effort in a dark room would quickly become his enduring signature and a representation of the storm he carried inside. Even though the payment was only $50, Stephen felt as though he was in Madison Square Garden, standing beneath the chilly flicker of fluorescent lights in a school gymnasium. While only a few children clapped nervously from the stands, he screamed as if the entire world was listening, his body contorting and his soul leaking out. Aerosmith wasn't wealthy or well-known that evening, but they were genuine. Stephen was aware that nothing could put out a fire once it had been started, but the path ahead was still harsh. Stephen's most intimate composition, Dream On, which he had written while lying on a waterbed years earlier, was included on their debut album Aerosmith, which was released in 1973. It was his heart carved into melody, his soul etched in sound. However, it failed when it got to the global stage, only making it to number 59 on the charts. Later, Stephen admitted that he was afraid the dream would end before it could fully come to life. The band also had nights when they questioned whether they would make it through another week. But Stephen would not give up. Persuaded that the world would eventually comprehend, he sang Dream On, night after night with the same unadulterated rage. And the miracle arrived in 1976. After being reissued, the song shot to number 6 on the Billboard charts. What appeared doomed was revived. Its resurrection was evidence that all the sacrifices, sleepless nights, missed meals, and perspiration in that small Boston flat had been worthwhile. The boy who had been written off as hopeless was now the lead singer of a band that was ready to leave its mark on rock and roll history, not just a bunch of kids playing in the dark. And with each scream, Stephen reminded the world that a storm had emerged from silence, rejection, and hunger, a storm that would never be forgotten. Rock and roll was at its hottest in the mid-1970s. Steven Tyler, who was only in his late 20s, was at the center of the fire and was already living like a man who had been burned twice. He was a sight to behold on stage, his screams slicing the air like thunder, his lean body twisting and leaping, his scarves whipping from his microphone stand. As he reached for notes that seemed unattainable by humans, fans crowded arenas from coast to coast, holding their breath, and then exploding when the sound burst through the rafters. Aerosmith provided its anthem to a restless generation with Toys in the Attic, 1975, and Rocks, 1976, which included songs like Sweet Emotion, Walk This Way, and Back in the Saddle. Battle cries reverberated throughout American youth, bouncing off dorm walls and rattling car speakers. By the end of the decade, Aerosmith had transcended from a band to the American rock kings, known as the Rolling Stones of America. However, the fame came at a high cost. Few people could comprehend the cost of Stephen's scream, the gift that gave him immortality, and the sound that made him known as the Demon of Screaming. He left the stage each night with his vocal cords stretched to their breaking point, and his throat burned. He gripped tea and honey cups, muttered through the rasp, and pondered whether his voice would hold up on another tour. "I would pay anything to hit that note," he said quietly, his admission tinged with pride and desperation. On some nights following the final encore, he sank into a chair in the dressing room, his body shaking, and listened to the roar of thousands followed by a deafening silence. Days turned to nights on the road. The tour bus was a bed where he snatched restless sleep between cities, and hotels turned into cages. He was chained by schedules. Supervisors insisted on longer sets, louder performances, and higher notes. Journalists circled like hawks, feeding the myth that Steven Tyler was untouchable while fans cried out for more. But his prison was the myth. He was always afraid that one broken note, one slip would ruin everything. He thus contributed more than just his voice. He gave up his breath, his body, and his essence. However, the alchemy of rock and roll overcame the pain in the spotlight. Whole crowds screamed back when Stephen yelled, "Walk this way," as though they were being stoked by the same fire. Fans thought they were listening to a prophet of sound rather than just a singer when Sweet Emotion came out of his mouth. Every performance was both a victory and a struggle, pain and joy intertwined. With platinum records, sold-out arenas, and their music ingrained in American culture, Aerosmith was at the pinnacle by the late 1970s, but every ovation was a shadow for Steven Tyler. The whisper of his deteriorating voice and the quiet of his trembling body followed each standing roar. His crown served as both his scream and his double-edged, ruthless blade. The legend was etched in scars and fire, and the darker the shadows grew, the higher the flame burned, awaiting the test of one man's endurance. The fire that had carried Aerosmith and Steven Tyler to the American rock mountaintop soon started to devour them. Off-stage, what had felt like freedom on stage turned into a never-ending cycle of tours, oppressive schedules, and the constant pressure to continue proving the myth they had created. Aerosmith were giants by the late 1970s, but when the pressure of fame becomes too much, even giants can falter. The media followed them around at all times. Hotel doors were clawed at by fans. Managers insisted on longer nights, louder screams, and larger shows. A place where he tasted godhood under the lights before stumbling into the shadows. Coughing, trembling, and drowning in exhaustion, the stage became both heaven and hell for Steven Tyler, who was still under 40. It was during these years that Joe Perry and Steven Tyler earned the moniker Toxic Twins. The name was legendary to the media, wild, brash, even glitzy. It was, in fact, prophecy. Together, they plunged into a fog of alcohol, cocaine, and heroin, poisons that initially passed for rocket fuel before turning out to be slow-acting poison. The fall is more vicious when the high is sharper. Tours ended in fractures rather than triumph. Backstage tempers flared. They broke guitars. Friendships broke down. Once brotherhood-inspired songs now faltered under the strain of disorder. The physical toll was brutal, and what had once been harmony was rotting into silence. Steven was brutally caught in the act of his recklessness in 1980. His body was smashed against the asphalt after a reckless ride and a sudden spike in speed. Like two tight guitar strings, bones snapped. The weight of the impact crushed the ribs. His face was splashed across front pages of newspapers. Candles were lit and prayers were whispered by fans. Behind the hospital doors, however, there was only quiet. A man lying flat on his back, shackled to his bed by plaster and agony, staring at a blank ceiling. His bones healed over the course of 2 arduous months, but no physician was able to fix the crack in his soul. Every night he closed his eyes and reenacted the crash, including the tire screech, the engine's roar, and the hollow thud of flesh against the ground. The idea that this chapter was written by his own chaos tormented him nonstop. Even though his body might recover, his soul continued to bleed in silence, plagued by an unanswerable question. How many more hits could he take before even the music stopped supporting him? The fissures grew into a collapse by 1984. Finally, Steven's body betrayed him in Springfield, Illinois, under the harsh glare of stage lights. His knees gave way in the middle of the performance. He staggered, then crumpled next to his scarf-wrapped microphone, which clattered to the floor. The audience initially roared, believing it to be just another rock theater performance. However, seconds went by. The roar died down to a deafening silence. His scarves were spread out across the stage like fallen battle flags of a war he was no longer able to fight, and thousands of eyes were fixed on the spotlight where the demon of screaming lay motionless. His name was screamed by some fans. Others clutched their mouths in shock as they sobbed aloud. It felt like a tomb now, echoing with silence more deafening than any scream. Where only moments before it had been a temple of sound, it was a prophetic moment, not just a startling one. The brotherhood that had propelled Aerosmith to the top disintegrated in a matter of months. The man who had once used a single cry to bend arenas to his will was now a broken figure beneath the lights, living evidence that even the most immortal voices could be silenced by their own demons. Joe Perry turned to leave. The band once roared as the Rolling Stones of America broke up in front of the world, with Brad Whitford following. Steven's personal life had equally destructive shadows amid the chaos. Careless decisions made in the haze of drugs and celebrity left wounds that would last beyond the decade. He made the foolish and chaotic decision to start a destructive relationship with a teenage fan, one that would reverberate in courtrooms decades later, carrying with it regret and shame that no round of applause could wash away. Steven was too inebriated at the time to realize the seriousness of his actions. However, the stain on his story and the shadow of that error turned into a ghost that followed him into every quiet, a wound that no scream could ever cure. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a decade marked by broken glass, broken strings, and murmured doubts in addition to headlines. The man who had once commanded arenas with a scream started to wonder if he could rekindle that fire as albums faltered and shows descended into chaos. Years later, Stephen confessed, "I lost faith in myself." His remorseful admission showed vulnerability rather than haughtiness, the cry of someone who had flown too near to the sun and felt his wings give way. Once a storm that rocked the heavens, the demon of screaming had been reduced to a whisper of himself. Gasping under the crushing weight of his own legend, the paradox was cruel. He was now in danger of being consumed by the very gift that had given him immortality. Nevertheless, that collapse had a deeply human quality. After the performance, there is silence for each applause that a performer receives. Even the brightest stars can feel insignificant, unsure, and lost in that silence. The world believed the story was over. However, the harsher and more hopeful reality was that the shadows had only just started to attack. Stephen's struggle was far from over. The seed of a larger truth, that a life's value is determined by its courage to rise again rather than by its ability to avoid falling, was concealed among the rubble of those years. By the middle of the 1980s, Steven Tyler was on the verge of silence. His voice, once the most powerful weapon in rock, was now in ruins. His body was battered and his spirit was hollowed out by years of chaos. But he decided to fight rather than give up. He entered a rehab facility in 1986 and started the grueling process of recovering, which included retraining his lungs to breathe, making scarred vocal cords obey, and teaching him how to stand without swaying and sing without breaking. Sweat, tremors, sleepless nights, and the unvarnished humility of a man rebuilding himself from rubble were all that was present in those rooms. Nothing glitzy. Years later, he would remember the confession, "I had to learn to sing again," which was both triumphant and heartbreaking. The first glimmer of light emerged from that discipline. He received an unexpected lifeline from fate that same year. Aerosmith's "Walk This Way," a song that was once destined to fade into the 1970s archives, was reimagined by hip-hop pioneers Run DMC. The cultural explosion that ensued was nothing short of seismic, shattering boundaries between rap and rock and thrusting Aerosmith back into the public eye. It wasn't merely a return for Stephen. Resurrection was the event. Another chance had been given to the demon of screaming, and he seized it with all his might. Aerosmith roared into their second act with a vengeance even though he was in his 40s. Get a Grip, Pump, and Permanent Vacation were more than just albums. They were survival manifestos. Songs like Dude Looks Like a Lady, Love in an Elevator, and Crying blared on radios all over the world. The band grew even bigger while they were on MTV. Crazy, Crying, and Amazing, their music videos, became iconic images of the 1990s. One revelation was more painful for Stephen than any chart achievement. At the age of 11, Liv Tyler, his daughter, realized that her father was the rock god she had seen on TV and in posters. It was more than just a generational pop culture moment when she co-starred with Alicia Silverstone in Aerosmith's music videos. A family was trying to put itself back together. The thread that mended the wounds that fame had previously torn apart was music. For Stephen, a voice alone was no longer sufficient for redemption. It was about love, blood, and legacy. The circle felt complete by 2001, when he was in his early 50s. Aerosmith's name was inscribed next to immortals when they were admitted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was vindication for Stephen. Every scar, recurrence, and agonized cry had been recorded in history. But Tyler wouldn't remain motionless, not even on that mountaintop. In 2011, at 63, Steven Tyler stunned the world by stepping onto the set of American Idol. It was unimaginable to millions. The man who once dominated stadiums with fire and fury, the demon of screaming, is now sitting behind a desk, evaluating hopefuls who are hardly older than his own grandchildren. Betrayal was cried by some fans. For others, it was evolution. Old wounds reopened inside Aerosmith. Their frontman had given up rock for TV, according to bandmates. However, Stephen refused to back down. He said, "I can't be held hostage anymore." It wasn't conceit. It was freedom. He had been bound to myth for decades and was supposed to scream in the same manner indefinitely. However, Stephen was sick of being a prisoner, and myths are prisons. However, beneath the defiance was something more subdued and sorrowful, the pain of a man who had sacrificed everything for the stage and was now asking the world to see him as more than a scream. Reinvention resulted from that defiance. We're All Somebody from Somewhere, Stephen's debut solo album, was released in 2016 at the age of 68. Many were shocked to learn that it wasn't rock. It was rural. The thunderous roars of 50,000 spectators and the stadium pyrotechnics were no more. Rather, he preferred intimate settings where his voice could both roar and whisper, where stories flowed like confessions, and where laughter reverberated more deeply than applause. Removing the legend to reveal the artist who still yearned for connection and still feared the silence after the song ended was the most vulnerable act of all for a man who was once revered as untouchable. Glory was not the purpose of those evenings on tiny stages. They were about surviving, about demonstrating to himself that despite the roar of arenas, his voice still had value. Against all odds, the scream came back, deeper, richer, and more memorable than before. But there was a shadow underneath that return. Steven Tyler carried the silent grief of a man who understood how fleeting everything was, and how quickly the voice could disappear again, even as the world celebrated his rebirth. He refused to be a relic after 50 years of success and failure. But there was a hint of melancholy in his restlessness. He was still burning, still bold, and still alive. However, each note he sang seemed to be a warning as well as a victory, a reminder that surviving is just the start of a new battle, not the conclusion of the tale. The loneliness of a man haunted by decisions no spotlight could erase could never be concealed by the stage, but it could conceal fatigue. Every encore was overshadowed by the secret scar that Steven Tyler bore beneath the roars and applause. In 1973, at 27, while Aerosmith's fame was just beginning its ascent, he entered into a relationship with Julia Holcomb, a teenage fan of only 16. Steven's decision to seek legal guardianship in an attempt to keep her near him was the result of blindness and chaos rather than wisdom. The result was turbulence rather than true love. Drug-hazed nights, party-filled days, and a shaky bond that shook under the strain of instability. By 1975, tragedy had arrived, accompanied by flames and smoke. Black fumes filled the air as a fire tore through their shared house. Julia was carrying what might have been Steven's first child. Fearing that the baby would be harmed by drugs, poisons, and the turmoil of his own tumultuous life, Steven forced her to make a choice from which neither of them could ever recover. The abortion was more than just a medical procedure. It was a break that reverberated long after it had occurred. The silence that followed was irreversible, but walls could be rebuilt. More than a house had been consumed by smoke. A future had been devoured by it, more deeply than any scar the stage could ever leave. It became a wound etched into Steven's conscience. He didn't understand the seriousness because he was too young, too careless, and too preoccupied with his celebrity. But the truth became unavoidable with time. Julia's story reappeared in 2022, decades later, making headlines and appearing in courtrooms. Steven saw what the outside world saw as scandal, as the reappearance of a ghost he had never been able to shake. "Those were the darkest years of my life," he acknowledged, his words bearing the weight of both lament and confession. The whisper of that past was too loud to be muffled by the applause he heard on stage. However, there is more to this story than controversy. It serves as a warning about the dangers of fame when combined with immaturity and addiction, as well as about power being given too easily. It is a mirror reflecting how easily chaos can skew love, not an excuse, how decisions made while blind can have lifelong effects. This was more than just the tale of a relationship gone bad. It was the birth of a ghost, a shadow that followed Steven through all the ovations and screams over the years. However, as one bond crumbled into ashes, another one that would bring him a daughter and the first shaky hope of salvation appeared inconspicuously. B. Buell, a singer and model who glistened at the heart of New York's music scene, and Steven started a brief but memorable romance in 1976. They only spent a little more than a year together. The birth of his daughter, Liv, in July 1977, however, was a gift that was more significant than any platinum record. But happiness came with sadness. Steven's life was too precarious at the time to provide a secure home for a child, because he was engulfed in the storm of fame and addiction. B made a decision that was both heartbreaking and protective, after realizing this with painful clarity. Todd Rundgren, her longtime partner, lovingly filled in as Liv's father, providing the young child with stability in a place where chaos might have engulfed her. For Steven, it meant being banished from his own daughter's narrative and observing from a distance as she developed under a different man's name. To her, he was a ghost, constrained by silence that hurt more than any scream he had ever let out on stage. By the time Liv turned 9, There was no denying the similarity. At the age of 11, the truth could no longer be concealed as whispers became louder, and questions began to arise. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. Liv's real father was the rock god that millions worshipped, the man she had only ever seen on TV and in magazines. The moment was both a miracle and a tragedy for Stephen. His daughter was here, gorgeous and alive. The cruel weight of time was also present here. 10 years of first words, first steps, and little everyday moments that he would never get back. He later confessed, "I had missed so much," in words that were tinged with both wonder and sadness. Nevertheless, healing started even inside that pain. From the pieces that fate had left them, father and daughter gradually forged a bond. Liv made appearances in Aerosmith's well-known videos in the 1990s, including Crazy, Cryin', and Amazing, transforming popular culture into poetry and healing seemingly irreparable wounds. It was a spectacle for the world. It was redemption for Stephen. What chaos had torn apart had finally been brought together by music. Even after the world hailed him as a rock god, the pain persisted as a silent reminder that he had overlooked the most commonplace and revered role of all, being present when his daughter called someone dad for the first time. Steven Tyler believed that 1978 would be the year that he would finally find peace after having already burned through chaos. He reached for something he had never really experienced at the age of 29, worn and battered by the storm of fame. Stability. He thought he had found it in Surrenda Fox, then 26 years old. A gorgeous former model and muse of the glam rock era, she was a woman who possessed the glitz of New York's nightlife, as well as the scarred vulnerability of someone who had survived her own fires. She was brilliant, incisive, and captivating. Their union felt inevitable, like two comets colliding because they were too bright to be ignored. They got married that same year, and their daughter Mia was born, seemingly as if destiny had blessed this shaky new beginning. For a fleeting and brilliant moment, Stephen was not the screaming demon but rather a husband and father, holding his newborn in trembling arms and whispering promises of eternity, while his vision was blurred by tears. There was a misleading light in those first few months. They appeared untouchable to friends, dinners full of boisterous laughter, with Surrenda's sharp wit and Stephen's flamboyant charm bouncing off each other. The two of them appear to be royalty from the heyday of rock. They were photographed hand in hand, glowing under flashing bulbs, symbols of a glittering scene. However, there were more delicate and tender moments behind the curtain. At night, Stephen paces the floor of their house. Surrenda leaned against the doorway, watching with a smile that could muffle the sounds of the outside world, while Mia humming lullabies that were half sung and half sobbed against his chest. For a brief moment it appeared as though love might calm the storm, that the yelling frontman might at last turn into a man of peace, and that the mayhem might give way to something complete and enduring. However, beauty can also be a disguise. Hairline fractures started to form beneath the surface even as the cameras flashed and the world envied their fire. These fractures could not be sustained for very long by any amount of glitz, laughter, or whispered promises. It was a brutal descent. While addiction turned every flaw into a sharpening tool, touring pushed Stephen until he was barely a shadow of his former self. Once fiery and intoxicating, passion changed into volatility, tenderness turned into yelling, love turned into suspicion, and the fire that had initially united them now engulfed them both. Once musical, laughter-filled nights turned into drug-laced arguments. Silence hung heavy and oppressive as mornings began. A house and a heart are shared by two people. Once his wit and sparkle partner Surrenda turned into his pain-related enemy. Love had the power to tear you apart and leave you hurting. Later, with awe and regret in his voice, Stephen would confess. In her own words, Surrenda acknowledged that she had loved him deeply, but that no soul could survive the chaos. Everything was tainted by addiction. Alcohol and cocaine distorted logic and heightened anger, escalating minor arguments into conflicts. Formerly envious of their genius, friends now turned away, murmuring that the glittering couple of rock's heyday was coming to an end right in front of them. There were scenes behind the closed doors of luxury that were more heartbreaking than any stage play. Stephen collapsing after nights of excess and surrendering in tears. Like fighters in a ring, the two of them circled one another, with no one ever winning. What had started out as a quest for peace had turned into a battlefield where love itself was being torn apart piece by piece. The marriage had bled itself dry by 1987. The legal bond was broken by the divorce papers, but the emotional devastation persisted. Carrying grief and rage, Surrenda spilled her story into her memoir Dream On. Turning those pages years later was humiliating and painful for Stephen, but it was impossible to ignore. It was like reopening scars with a knife. He acknowledged the truth concealed in her words when he said, "It hurt to see myself through her eyes." The memory of how much love had once existed between them, now reduced to ashes for the world to analyze, was what pierced his darkest moments the most, not the condemnation or the shame. This tragedy's last act was composed in the clinical silence of a hospital room rather than on stage. Once brimming with humor and glitz, Surrenda Fox lay weak and broken in 2002, her body destroyed by brain cancer. Her strength, voice, and even the fire that had once matched Stephen's had been taken away by the illness. The rage, betrayal, and chaos of their years together had been erased by time. A woman Stephen had once recklessly adored, the mother of his daughter and a part of his life that no amount of celebrity could ever erase. That was all that was left. There was no sign of the screaming demon when Stephen walked into that room. He was a man looking straight into death, not a rock god or even an ex-husband. He sat by her bedside while the walls whispered in silence and the machines hummed. Once ringed and brimming with restless energy, Surrenda's hand trembled in his own as delicate as paper. Stephen hung on to respect what had been, not to reignite love. The clamor of their past, their quarrels, their addictions, and their angry memoirs vanished in that instant. Memory hung there, heavy and unsaid. Stephen said goodbye in a whisper as her breath became labored. He would later confess with frankness, "We burned each other, but I never stopped caring." The loss of Surrenda was more profound than grief. Applause could never lift the weight that Stephen carried out of that room. The pain of unfulfilled promises, wasted years, and love turned to ruin. It was not your typical heartbreak. Rather, it was a warning in the form of fire and flesh. Surrenda had served as a mirror and a muse. She accentuated his shortcomings while reflecting his genius. Their stormy, toxic, and intoxicating love served as a reminder that, in the absence of tranquility, passion will eventually devour everything it comes into contact with. Nevertheless, there was something incredibly human even in the ashes. Ultimately, all anger vanished, leaving only tenderness carved from suffering. A delicate elegance born in farewell. It was not a fairy tale romance between them. Grand and volatile, beautiful and doomed, it was a tragedy inscribed in the annals of rock and roll. It was possibly the most devastating love of Stephen's life. A tale that started in flames, ended in quiet, and left wounds that no amount of screaming could ever heal. Steven Tyler came into the late 1980s hoping for something more subdued, something that would last after witnessing love burn to ashes like wildfire. He looked to Teresa Barerick, a fashion designer whose world seemed so different from the thunderous roar of arenas, for stability at the age of 39. Exhausted by the storms of fame and chaos, she was a stable, imaginative woman who promised a home instead of the frantic drama of rock's nightlife. They got married in 1988. 2 children soon followed, Taj in 1991 and Chelsea in 1989. For some time, it appeared that Stephen had discovered the one thing he had always desired, a family unaffected by the upheaval of his professional life. Those were his calmest years, according to friends. There were pictures of quiet dinners with laughter rather than headlines, and of Stephen pacing the hallways holding a baby. The demon of screaming appeared ready to whisper during those times, to exchange mayhem for compassion. Stephen would later remark, "I thought I'd finally done it. I believed I had overcome the odds." However, a man's desire for peace does not make demons go away. Addiction, distance, the never-ending demands of the stage, and the shadows of his past all resurfaced in the marriage like smoke through wall cracks. What started out as tenderness gradually turned into alienation. Arguments became more pointed and silences lengthened. Living under the lights of arenas that were sold out, Stephen was frequently absent, leaving Teresa to bear the responsibility of raising their kids by herself. They did not experience a fiery explosion of love. Silently, it deteriorated. Another stone chipped away from the foundation every year. The marriage ended in 2006, almost 20 years later. It was a heartbreak like no other for Stephen. Something quieter and colder than the dramatic implosions of youth. The one dream he had really believed in slowly dying. He once admitted that losing a family is worse than losing oneself. The seemingly indestructible rock god was left gazing at the remains of something commonplace but priceless. Home. Still, he made another attempt. Love for Steven continued to be both his blessing and his bane. In 2011, when he was already in his 60s, he got engaged to Erin Brady, a woman almost 20 years his junior, who was full of life, ambition, and the vitality Steven believed would see him through his last years. After a lifetime of storms, she appeared to him as the rock he could finally rest on. He talked about her as if she were the fulcrum he had been looking for all along. Many thought that this would be his final engagement, the one in which the rock god would age in peace. However, those who demand permanence are not always treated kindly by love. Age, lifestyle, and expectation gaps proved to be insurmountable. Erin yearned for something more stable, while Steven remained restless, haunted, and unwilling to give in to quiet domesticity. The engagement ended after 2 years. For Steven, resignation, something far more eerie, marked the end rather than scandal or rage. At age 65, he was confronted with a reality more painful than any failed note or stage fall. Despite decades of searching, fame, wealth, and rebirth, he had never managed to hold on to the one thing he most desired: enduring love. 2 decades, 2 women, and 2 distinct aspirations. One gave him children, the flimsy illusion of permanence, and almost 20 years. The other gave him hope of a last haven, but she disappeared almost as fast as she had come. Both left him on his own. Millions of people worship him, but he still yearns for something as human and delicate as home. Steven Tyler had already weathered storms that would have swept most men away by the turn of the millennium. He had fought his way out of heartbreak, addiction, and the turmoil of celebrity. The betrayal of the body, however, is an enemy that even legends cannot defeat, and this was the cruelest wound of all for a man whose very soul was forged in sound. The hammer fell in 2003. 11 months of suffering followed the hepatitis C diagnosis. His veins sank with needles. His blood was scorched by chemicals, and he lay sweating and shivering by himself under sterile sheets night after night. He was still yelling into the spotlight on posters outside. He felt, however, like a ghost haunting his own flesh inside the hospital. He had no family to protect him from the quiet, no bandmates and no applauding audience. Only the sound of machinery and the conscious fear that his own body had betrayed him. He would later admit that every scar serves as a reminder that I lived. However, the cruel aspect of survival was the nagging fear that it was all that remained. Another dagger pierced him just when he believed he had survived the worst. His throat betrayed him in the middle of a 2006 tour. The instrument that had made him king was flooded with blood when a sudden hemorrhage exploded inside his vocal cords. His throat was carefully opened by surgeons, whose steady hands struggled to preserve the voice that had previously broken through ceilings. A tour was cancelled in part. However, the silence that followed haunted Steven more. Every raspy murmur in the mirror seemed like a harsh practice run for a life without music. If I can't scream, who am I? No wound was as deep as the question. The stage itself then turned against him in 2009. Steven staggered and fell from the platform in front of thousands. The crowd initially roared, thinking it was just another crazy stunt. But the applause turned to horror as he lay crumpled and still. He was broken by injuries to his head, neck, and shoulder, and was taken away as a frail man who had been knocked down by gravity rather than as a rock god. The man who had worshipped music the most was betrayed for the first time by the very altar of music. Even time had joined the fight by 2019. Aerosmith's Las Vegas residency had to be canceled due to foot surgery. He had leapt and strutted like a man who defied death for decades. Now, however, every step was a painful negotiation. Age was winning as each limp served as a reminder. Even something as simple as walking had turned into his new battleground. Then 2023 arrived, the most heinous betrayal to date. His worst fear was confirmed by doctors: a fractured larynx which would cause his voice cartilage to crack and become unstable. On certain days, a rough yet alive sound would emerge. Nothing on other days. Imagine hearing nothing but silence while you stand in front of thousands of people, the spotlight blazing, your breath waiting for the first note. This was more than just an injury to Steven. It was an existential crisis. His very name. On the verge of disappearing into emptiness, the screaming demon shuddered. This was more than just sickness. One brutal blow at a time, the self was being dismantled. The very gift that had once made him immortal collected the debt from every scar, every postponed tour, and every whisper where there had been a scream. He had been a comet for decades, burning wild and dazzling millions, but he was bound to break under his own fire. Steven Tyler now had to pay for a life without breaks during the quiet hours of hospitals and recovery centers. Nevertheless, he refused to give up even when he was stalked by silence and the mirror reflected weakness rather than fire. He came back, he sang. He had the audacity to think that truth could be conveyed even through a broken voice. The stage was no longer about dominance for him. It had to do with defiance. He vowed not to let the wildness of his past or the betrayals of his body dictate the last chapter of his story, and each note he pushed through damaged chords was less of a performance than a promise. Now excess time and fate itself have taken their toll on his body. However, there is more than just pain in those wounds. They serve as a mirror for all of us. An untouchable man turned out to be evidence of how brittle even legends can be. In addition to illustrating the negative effects of living on the edge, Stephen's scars also show his resiliency. We hear humanity rather than weakness in his cracked voice, the sound of someone who has lost a lot but still refuses to lose himself. We catch a glimpse of a truth greater than glory itself in his refusal to accept silence, that a life, no matter how wild or broken, can still end with the bravery to continue singing when everyone else expects only silence. By 2025, Steven Tyler is no longer the flamboyant figure who used to dominate arenas every night. Once shattering ceilings and igniting generations, the scream now trembles with vulnerability, and the wounds from decades of living at full speed are still visible on his body. Nevertheless, there is something incredibly poignant about his way of life in this latter stage of his journey. Quieter, more stable, but still defiantly flamboyant. Rings flashing on his fingers, scarves still draped on the microphone stand, and eyes that are still burning from the mischief of rock and roll. His world today is a study in contrasts, spanning coasts. He withdraws to his longtime residence in Marshfield, Massachusetts, which is modest in comparison to the arenas he once filled. The locals welcome him as Stephen rather than as a legend. He shares quiet streets and local eateries, becoming a part of the community. He escapes into a nearly $5 million villa in Maui, Hawaii, thousands of miles away. It is 3,000 square feet of glass and ocean, with aquariums that rise like living art walls and an infinity pool. The roar of stadium crowds is replaced there by the crash of waves in the salt air. And now silence is comforting to the man who once screamed to be heard. Another haven, a foothold in the city where rock gods are immortalized, is Los Angeles. However, Stephen typically opts for the convenience of home. His garage, which still houses a 1972 Lamborghini Miura, a blood-red Ferrari Enzo, a vintage Porsche 911 Turbo, and a Rolls-Royce Ghost, is a museum of speed and luxury. Reminiscent of a man who once chased adrenaline like oxygen, they are shining remnants of a life lived carelessly. It is estimated that he is worth between $130 and $150 million. Despite all of the wealth, Stephen acknowledges that a person's life is not measured by their financial status. On this part of the journey, he is not traveling alone. Amy Preston, his partner of almost 10 years, is by his side and has been more than just a friend. He can carry his flamboyance without worrying about collapsing, because she is a reassuring presence, a carer, and the anchor. Her quiet devotion has been a sort of salvation to a man who was once consumed by chaos. The best legacy is family which surrounds him. Each of his children, Liv, Mia, Chelsea, and Taj, carries a fragment of his narrative and serves as a reminder of the lives that were impacted by his notoriety. Chelsea and Taj are paving their own creative paths. Mia has her own, and Liv is now a well-known actress. Collectively, they serve as evidence that his weakest ties persisted, as well as the continuation of his lineage. And now that he is a grandfather, Stephen discovers a new kind of stage, the living room, where laughter from the grandchildren reverberates more loudly than applause, where tiny hands tug at his scarves, and where innocence provides a healing that an ovation could never provide. This is perhaps the most amazing act of all, the silent, gentle legacy of love, for a man who was once defined by fire and chaos. He has also made the decision to give back. Inspired by Aerosmith's eerie ballad, Janie's Got a Gun, Stephen established Janie's Fund in 2015. Since then, the project has raised millions of dollars, constructed Janie's house as a safe haven for girls who have been abused and neglected, and given thousands of people hope, support, and counseling. According to Stephen, scars can serve as a haven, and in the course of his mission, he has turned his own injuries into a shield for others. He performed for Janie at Jam in 2024 and 2025 despite his injury, his spirit unwavering despite his voice deteriorating. Supporters were split. Some lamented his screams fractures. Others marveled at his disobedience. However, that might be the best way to describe Steven Tyler nowadays. Persistent rather than flawless. The price has been demanded by the body. Aerosmith had to cancel their final Peace Out tour due to a combination of hepatitis C, surgeries, broken bones, and ultimately a fractured larynx in 2023. Steven sat in silence during a private band meeting on February 8, 2024, before muttering, "We don't cheat the fans," which would reverberate louder than any yell. With that, he ended his touring career with honor rather than shame. His story does not, however, end in silence. His generation-spanning collaboration with British rocker Youngblood, One More Time, is set to be released in September 2025. There will be a remix of Aerosmith's first album, demonstrating that he still respects the past while exploring new possibilities. Meditation, journaling, painting, and the customs of a more subdued existence occupy his days. The once untouchable man now embraces vulnerability, which makes him seem more relatable and possibly more inspirational than before. There are more metrics to evaluate Steven Tyler's legacy than just numbers. Even though he has already achieved immortality with 150 million albums sold and a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, his greatest legacy lies in the wounds that became tales, the chaos that became empathy, and the bravery to give back when it would have been easier to keep quiet. His voice falters occasionally, and he is no longer the unstoppable demon of screaming. However, his experience serves as a reminder that greatness is not about being flawless. Resilience is the key. Steven Tyler has demonstrated that even broken voices can convey truth through silence, fire, ruin, and redemption. The heart continues to reverberate even if the scream subsides. Let him know if his music has ever made you feel better, more at ease, or ignited your soul. Your standing ovation could be a simple like or a shared memory, evidence that his song was never exclusively his. We've had it forever.